So you guys should be able to see my screen at this point. So thanks, Pam. So basically, as Pam mentioned, my name is Matthew. Thanks for the opportunity to be able to present this content to you. Basically, my role within Desjardins is basically managing, one of the responsibilities is managing the team that does background checks. We do approximately 27,000 background checks a year on top of... I think there's someone that is it possible to mute? Thank you. So we do about 27,000 background checks a year. I've been managing this team for the last 10 years. Obviously, it's a huge job. You know, the risk tolerance is quite zero when it comes to basically getting these results out. And obviously, we need to do it quite rapidly, quite fast in the context that we are right now, because obviously those who work in HR know that hiring is quite difficult nowadays. So we'll be going over quite a few, I would say, high-level points when it comes to criminal background checks. Now, we're really going to leave this at criminal background checks, and we'll touch base on credit as well. So we won't be touching aspects sort of when it relates to employment history, so reference checks or credential checks or diploma verification, things like that. So we're really going to try to keep it down to the criminal aspect of the background check process. There's a lot of misconceptions on what background checks are, what they cover, what they do, what to expect from them. So we'll be touching all of those things and what to do when you actually do get something coming out of a background check. So a lot of times people wonder why we do background checks. You know, the answer might sound quite obvious to many people because they want to know, you know, if the person has a criminal background. You want to know who you're hiring. Now, there could be a lot of other reasons, regulatory requirements, depending on what industry you're in. It might be a requirement. It's not just a question if you feel like doing it, you have to do it. You know, there's also best practices in the industry, and it could be all of the above. Now, the criminal background check is, I would say, more and more pretty much a staple of hiring, basically. A lot of times, if we're going back 10 years, a lot of companies, depending on the industry that they're in, simply didn't conduct a background check. They're pretty much basing themselves on prior history, references with past employers, but they wouldn't necessarily do a background check, or they would do a background check and not necessarily know what they're doing in terms of scope. So we'll go over all of those things and basically explain the different types of checks that you could do, the scope of each one, and basically, depending on the risk tolerance of your company, you know, it'll help you choose what you need to do. So the first part, before even starting to contemplate what type of background check you're going to do, is basically have a very solid background check policy within your company. Regardless of how big, how small your company is, having a solid policy is very important. Now, depending on the size of your company, you might not have all of the departments that are listed here: human resources, talent acquisition. You know, human resources, talent acquisition sometimes are the same group. Sometimes part of them are outsourced. You might or might not have a corporate security department or a compliance department. Sometimes some of them or both of them are joined, and a legal department as well. Sometimes it's external counsel that you'll have. But one thing's for sure is that when you're actually elaborating or conceptualizing your corporate background check policy, it's very important to have all those aspects and all those departments work together and have a good understanding on what's going to be done, what the scope's going to be, when you're going to do a background check, and if the case need be, depending on what your company decides or what the regulatory requirements are you going to screen employees during the course of employment? Now, the background check policy is very important because it'll establish all those things, and legal and compliance will actually make sure that your policy adheres to the frameworks that you have to abide to. Now, if in case there's any disputes or misunderstanding or basically lack of understanding of when things should be done, every single time the policy will be coming into play to basically clear any not misconceptions, but gray zones when it comes to what should be done and who does what. So roles and responsibilities is also very important. In a lot of companies, especially larger companies, the actual policy on how background checks are managed are actually owned by human resources, but the application of the policy on how it's done and the actual gears of how the mechanism on how it's executed actually belongs to the security department. So understanding those roles and the communication between those different entities is very, very important. Now, another thing that's quite important as well is determining when you're going to do your background check. Now, that's usually where your compliance and legal department will come into play. Depending on the industry you're in, the risk tolerance. Are you going to screen your shortlisted candidates? Are you going to screen the final candidate you're willing to give the offer to? Are you going to screen during the course of employment? Now, once the employee has an employment link with you, there's a lot of things you need to consider. Basically union agreements. There is certain times where you can't just arbitrarily just screen an employee. There has to be grounds or a clear policy that states that they have to be done. You also have to be careful that you don't conduct too many background checks, because then you could just become what they consider an abusive check. So you still have to remember to respect people's privacy when it comes to background checks, because it could get quite invasive. So the other thing that's really important to know is that a background check is not a crystal ball. I talk to a lot of people in a lot of different areas, and it's quite surprising what people think a background check is. A background check will not tell you what's going to happen in the future. There might be certain indicators based on past behaviors that could give you an indication, but by all means, it does not tell the future. It's a point-in-time check to tell you exactly what the person has done or has not done from the point where you've done the background check. Setting these expectations and explaining this to your internal stakeholders is very important. People whose business is not background checks or security functions will think there's many things. I could go over so many things that I've heard in the past where they think we plug people into a lie detector every single time we do a background check. So it really is a point-in-time check, depending on what you're looking for, and certain checks that you could do, which we'll get over in a few minutes, could help you determine if there could be a pattern. But it is by all means not an indication of what's going to happen in the future. So in Canada, there is two different types of background checks that could be conducted. The most common is a name-based criminal record check, which basically uses the names and date of birth of the person to establish criminal history. What's important to note that there is only one single repository of criminal history in Canada. It's with the RCMP's Canadian Police Information Centres, or what we usually call the CPIC system. Now, that is the only official database of criminal records in Canada. We'll go over the different other databases that you may be able to check, but the CPIC database is the gold standard when it comes to background checks. Now, there is the name-based, which is most common because it's the easiest way to do it. So as I mentioned, it'll basically run the name, first name, last name, date of birth of the individual against the CPIC database to see if what the candidate has declared as criminal offenses matches what's on the CPIC database. Now, there is weaknesses based on the name-based system. Sometimes there will be differences in the spelling of the names. There's the use of nicknames, legal name changes, and intentional changing of the names to avoid a criminal record history match. The other solution is fingerprinting, or basically what we call the certified criminal records check. Now, every single criminal record in Canada is matched with your fingerprints. It's not your SIN number, it's not your date of birth. The actual official match is done with your fingerprint. Now, when we're doing a fingerprint check, it's usually, normally, depending on what the standards are using in your company, a backup to your name-based check. So when you submit your fingerprints, usually it's done through a third party that has to be accredited by the RCMP. That fingerprint that they take, it's no longer based on ink and roller. It's actually on a glass screen which takes a digital imprint of your fingerprints. And that fingerprint is actually converted into what they call a NIST file, which is sent over to the RCMP electronically, and they match it through the CRTIS system, which is the Canadian Criminal Real-Time Identification Service, or what they call CRTIS. If you guys watched, all the criminal profilers and all those Criminal Mind shows in the U.S., you'll see them running fingerprints through the AFIS system. So it's the Canadian equivalent to that. Matches are done quite rapidly, and once the match is done, the fingerprint that's been submitted is destroyed. So it's not retained. Now, that comes out to almost 100% positive match. It is becoming the gold standard, and basically in the future, in the next few years in Canada, all criminal record checks in Canada will be switching over to fingerprinting. But there will have to be more points of services available for you to go and get your fingerprints done. It already is a standard in the U.S. For background checks. Fingerprinting is quite common over there, but that is coming to Canada in a few years. The other information that you could get basically on police records is what they call the police information check, which is also local police records, which include what the CPIC has to offer, as well as local police stations. That is a double-edged sword, because you could find out basically that there might be a record at the local police station, which is not necessarily a criminal offense, but you'll never know what it is. So for that, you'll have to try another little trick that we have up our sleeve, which is basically court records, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, to provide a criminal record check, there has to be a proper identification of the individual that you are conducting the background check for. The RCMP basically recognizes and allows for two types of identification methods when it comes to identifying your candidates for a criminal background check. The first one is an electronic identification, which usually uses questions that are based off the credit bureau. Now, you probably have had that in the past when you've been asked by another company to identify yourself. They'll ask you a few questions off your credit bureau that normally only you would know. And once you've successfully answered those 3 or 4 questions, you're considered authenticated. So that is one way of doing it. Depending on who's used it, you might have varied results, who your target audience is too as well for criminal background checks. Because if you fail that authentication, usually the backup process is sending them over to a provider which will be able to authenticate the person's ID in person, which will add extra time to the process. Now, the other method that's used is the good old school in-person or virtual ID verification method. If you are in person with the candidate, or nowadays, a lot of times what people will do are Skype meetings or FaceTime interviews, you will virtually at a distance verify this person's ID to make sure that the person consigning that's consigning the consent form is actually the same person that's on the ID. That certification is basically done to allow the police officer ultimately that's going to be doing the background check to ascertain that the individual that did sign the consent is the right person. So depending on your volume, depending on the types of candidates that you're screening, you would have to determine which one you would do. Now, obviously, if it's an electronic identification, you need a platform and a system to be able to do that. So most likely you would be outsourcing that part as well if you're doing that. If you're doing it in-house, then you can use the second method. Now, we talked about the CPIC database. Now, there's more than just one check that you could do. On top of the CPIC database, now we're going to concentrate mostly on Quebec and Ontario. In Quebec, we're relatively lucky to have a centralized court management system that publishes all of the court data, which is called SOQIJ, for the Société Québécoise d'Information Juridique. It's a state-run company, basically, that its sole purpose is to publish court documents and the court records to the public. In Ontario, not as lucky. We don't have that option in Ontario, but we do have a very good system of court runners. So if you've ever heard of what a court runner is, it's basically individuals that literally sit in the different courthouses in the province, and you could have a provider which has an agreement with all these people. And you could say, okay, well, I want to see if there's any court records for Jane Doe with this date of birth in the court system. They'll basically send out a message to all these court runners, and they'll each do their own checks, and whoever has a match will send back the result to your provider, and you'll get a copy of that. So it basically saves you from going in person. It is, regardless of it being, seemingly archaic, it's actually very efficient, and the results are quite fast. The advantage with SOQIJ is that you have a dashboard and you have a website where you could just go and consult these files. The result is almost instantaneous. The downside, though, is that if you are doing a lot of searches and if you're not sure exactly what you're looking for, it could get quite costly. I think just doing a search is about $3, and looking at a record is about $4.50. So it could get quite costly, but it is a very, very good tool because you won't necessarily get, what you'll get in the CPIC is basically guilty charges. So basically once the person's been found guilty, that's when it will pop up in the CPIC. But before that, while it's still in the court system, you won't necessarily get pending charges as a result, but you will get it looking at SOQIJ or court runners. So depending on the depth of information that you're looking for, you might want to do both. If you're only looking at local offenses and you don't necessarily want to look at the national database, then you would use the court runners and the SOQIJ database. But obviously, it's not the best solution. You always should be looking at the CPIC. As we mentioned before, there's also the local police checks. So that will tell you basically if the local police department has records on this individual, but not necessarily cases that have been brought before the courts. They won't divulge what it is. So basically, it could be things that are also pending as well. That could be a good indicator that, there's charges pending for this individual that hasn't necessarily been found guilty, or there hasn't been a decision made on the case yet. So if you're doing the local police check and it comes back as a negative result, that may be an indicator that you might want to look at the court records as well as the CPIC. Vulnerable sector checks are a completely different type of check. Now, the vulnerable sector check is something that was created in 2000, basically to help protect individuals that are vulnerable, so children, the elderly, against people that would have position of authority over them, depending on the type of job that you would do. So I'll give you an example. If you're a scoutmaster, if you work in a daycare, if you work in an old aged home, basically you would be subject to a vulnerable sector check. Now there's obviously a longer list than that. It's just to give you an example. So what a vulnerable sector check will do will provide you information that you would normally not get through a normal background check. So if the person has a pardon or a record suspension for sexual offenses, normally you wouldn't get that information. However, if you're conducting a vulnerable sector check, that information will be taken into consideration when it comes back as a result. Now, a lot of people would say, well, why don't we just do vulnerable sector checks for everyone? Because I would want to know that. It actually is an offense, according to the Criminal Records Act, to conduct a vulnerable sector check for someone that does not meet the requirements for a need for a vulnerable sector check. So it is really important to make sure that when you're actually conducting a vulnerable sector check, that it's for the right reason and for the right type of position. Normally, a vulnerable sector check will be done by your local police service. So when it comes to conducting background checks, I get the question quite often, well, should I do it myself or should I outsource it? The answer is not always the same depending on what your situation is. Obviously size of the company, which will dictate normally the amount of background checks you will be doing. The internal expertise that you have internally to conduct such an activity, obviously the volume, and the turnaround time. Now, you could completely outsource, you could completely do it in-house, but most of the cases usually have a hybrid solution where you would take care of most of the workflow yourself, but most of the time, even very large companies will outsource the criminal record check or the CPIC check to a service provider. Because, like I mentioned before, the CPIC check has to be done by a police service. A lot of these service providers already have agreements with different police services across Canada to conduct these verifications on their behalf. So normally what would happen is the consent form is signed, the required documentation is forwarded to your service provider. The service provider would then send that information over to the police station with whom they have an agreement. The verification is done, and the result comes back. Now, when it comes to a name-based search, usually what happens is they'll base themselves on the declaration that's on the consent form. So if a person declared no criminal history and that matches what's on CPIC, you'll get a result back saying that the result is valid and accurate. It could happen that a person omitted to include something. In that case, the result will come back as incomplete. Or if a person literally just lied about the type of offense they have, let's say they have an offense for fraud and they wrote down they have an offense for driving under the influence, that'll come back as inaccurate. So basically at that point, you have different options. You could actually have them go for fingerprinting, or you could have them fill another declaration. So turnaround time is also another issue. If you're completely outsourcing, it'll have to be in agreement with your provider. Internally, where I work, we have to get everything out within 48 hours. So some companies will also determine turnaround time based on if you provide conditional offers or not. That is something you would need to talk to with your human resources and legal department. If you're giving a conditional offer based on a background check, it does provide you with extra time to do your background check, but it also comes back with other complications when you actually do have to rescind the offer because you did find something on the criminal background check. One thing you're going to have to look for as well is international criminal checks. And depending on where you're hiring and where most of your candidates are coming from, you will have to do a criminal background check in another country besides Canada. Now, you do have to be careful with that because there is no standard on what is checked depending on what country you're dealing with. Not all have a national database. Some countries have a national database like Canada does with CPIC. Some countries don't. If you look at the states, there's a federal registry for federal offenses, but any state or local offense are not reported to the federal database. So even looking in the US, you might have to look at 3 different levels of government to be able to get a full background check result. Some countries only have local jurisdictions. So some countries, you'll have a local courthouse. They don't have a national system, so that will increase in cost and delays. And documentation requirements are very different as well when it comes to your country you're doing background checks with. Some countries will require original documentation. Some countries will require notarized documentation to provide background checks. Some countries even still require the good old ink and roller fingerprints to be submitted by courier. So what I would suggest is, obviously, if you're going to have to do these background checks, go with a provider that has the experience with dealing with it. You don't want to start having to do everything manually. It's not worth it. Now, one other thing that could be a solution, depending, is having this person provide you with documents they might already have. A lot of these individuals that are coming from different countries might already have a police certificate of good conduct when it comes to the originating country, because it was part of the immigration process. And a lot of times these documents could be authenticated with your provider, with the country of origin, relatively fast, sometimes within 48 hours. So that might be a solution instead of waiting sometimes days or even weeks. I've even seen months for international background checks, especially with the COVID situation going on right now. A lot of international countries are not putting the priority on international background checks. So that solution might be something that's quite interesting for you. So some companies won't do international background checks, but depending on regulatory requirements, you might have to. Some companies will do a background check internationally as soon as someone spent more than 6 months or a year outside of the country, even though they're a Canadian citizen. It really comes down to what your risk tolerance is for international background checks. So, when doing background checks, it does happen once in a while that you do find something. So a person does have a criminal history. Now, contrary to what people might think, you can't simply just refuse employment for someone because they have a criminal background. There's the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, where you have to make sure that, if you are refusing someone for a criminal background, you have to make sure that it's incompatible with the job function or the type of company that they're going to be working for. I'll give you an example that comes out, the most common example that we get. Someone that has a criminal record for driving under the influence. A lot of people don't know that a DUI charge is actually a criminal offense. A lot of people still think that a DUI charge is just a summons for, trying to find the word for it, but for a driving offense. It's not. A lot of people don't think it's criminal, but it is. So theoretically, a DUI charge makes you a criminal. However, if you're going to be doing a job where driving is not part of the requirements, you're not going to be operating any vehicles for the company, there's no link with your employment. Now, there could be exceptions when it comes to licensing. I'll give you an example. If you're an insurance agent, you're not driving a car or a vehicle for the company, but it might be a requirement by the issuing agency, let's say the AMF in Quebec, or in Ontario, the equivalent in Ontario, where they don't want any criminal background. So it might not be incompatible with the job function that you have at your company, but it could be a licensing requirement. So that's something you have to verify with the regulatory agency in question. So obviously, if you're working for a financial institution and you have a background, a criminal history for theft, fraud, and things like that, it's definitely not something you want. But then again, you still have to be careful, because you have to take in consideration time since the offense. So basically, if the individual was 18 at the time of the offense, and the person's now 40 years old, there hasn't been anything since, well, it could be something that you might consider as well. So if there hasn't been any recidivism, when it comes to criminal history, you could just be written off as, a mistake that the person did when they were young. Another interesting fact is you could also get a bit more details on what happened without actually having to ask the candidate. So you could actually go and pull the court record of what happened from the courts to get some background, basically where it happened, what was the circumstances behind the offense. That could also help you make a decision. So you shouldn't always take criminal background as face value too. There's always usually a story that you have to be careful with. I'll give you an example that happened in real life. We're looking at the background of someone that wanted to be hired, and you had break and enter. I'm looking for the word assault and theft. Right off the bat, you take a step back and you think, okay, well, this person's not very good for hiring. But when you look at the court records, basically you find out that it was just a dispute with his ex-girlfriend, and basically he went over to her house and basically knocked at the door. She didn't want to let him in. He pushed the door. It hit her. Not saying that it's okay, but because the door hit her, it was assault. He entered the home, so it's a break and enter, and he basically took the stereo system that thought was his, but she was able to prove that she paid for theft. It happened 10 years ago. It's things you need to consider. When you get the details, a lot of things change. A lot of the optics change. Now, what could also happen is that a person's been found guilty, but they've been discharged. Now, what that means basically is that the judge, at the time of sentencing, said, you know what, most of the time it's people that have only one offense. It was their first offense. Things that happened weren't necessarily really bad. They'll say, we'll give you a chance. We'll give you a discharge. So there's two different discharges, unconditional and conditional discharges. What that basically says is that if you promise to be good for a certain amount of time and you don't have any other offenses, basically your criminal record will erase itself. You get that a lot with people that are relatively young or people that have had very minor charges and they have never had a background. The advantage of that is that if in the case of unconditional discharge, after a year, your criminal offense will erase itself. And in the case of conditional discharge, it's after 3 years. What that'll do is it won't prohibit you from any sort of activities in the future. So, give you an example, someone that has a DUI charge would technically be banned from going into the U.S. because of their criminal history. But by getting a discharge after a year, if nothing happens, the information gets erased off of CPIC, and it's like if nothing happened. So it happens quite often, like I mentioned, usually with younger people or people that have never had a criminal history before. You have pardons, which is a completely different process. And you have to apply for a pardon. It goes through a very strict review. It's quite expensive and it takes a long time. Now, usually you're eligible for pardon after 7 years from the date of conviction. And it's an option that's available to an individual that wants to get rid of his criminal history. So, as I mentioned before, things also to take into consideration is the recidivism and the age at the time of offense too. So, obviously, if someone has a criminal record for theft when they're 40 years old versus someone that has a criminal record for theft when they're 18 and they're now 40, well, you're not going to look at it the same way, especially if nothing happens since. So all those things need to be taken into consideration when you're adjudicating basically a file. So if you're looking beyond criminal, there's certain other things that you could take a look at. There's social media searches. That's to be taken with a grain of salt. Obviously, more and more the individual's profile are no longer public. They're a lot more private. And you can start impersonating someone else to go and look at their social media profiles. Experience tells me that you won't find very much on there anyways. What's a lot more efficient is a simple Google search. If you're used to searching people's names, you know what to expect. So basically what I mentioned here is expect normal, but pay attention to the news. Normally, if you're searching someone's name on the first 2 pages of a Google search result, you'll get things like their Facebook profiles or LinkedIn profile. If they have an Instagram account, sometimes you'll get their the graduation pictures and things like that. But sometimes what will happen is you'll actually get news articles, sometimes for good things, sometimes for bad things. But you'd be surprised the amount of things that we caught just doing a simple Google search on the individual and finding out that, they've been associated with some sort of street gang, or they've been arrested for a certain thing, even before doing conducting the court searches or even the CPIC searches. There's credit checks. Now, credit checks could have a dual purpose. They could have the purpose of identification. The advantages with credit bureaus is that you have a person's name and address, which could be cross-checked with the information that you have on your application. Is the person have the same name written the same way? Do they use aliases? Because one thing that will show up on a credit bureau is known aliases that this individual uses. Is it the same address? Those are all information that you can use to help ascertain if you're dealing with the right person. Now, a lot of people look at the credit file for other purposes. What's important to take a note when you're looking at a credit file during the background check is that you're not doing credit adjudication. Okay, don't look at it as if you were extending a credit to this individual. It's not what it's for. Now, one thing that I would suggest is if you're doing credit checks during the background check process is to have an agreement with the providers, either Equifax or TransUnion, to make sure that the account that you're using simply does a soft hit on the credit bureau, okay, which won't affect the credit score. Very important because you're not doing credit adjudication. You don't want to penalize the individual because you're looking at his credit bureau because of a background check. Now, background checks, when you're looking at the credit file, you're not, like I mentioned, you're not looking at it in the same scope as providing credit to someone. What you're looking at most of the time is seeing, is this person in a situation where financial pressure that this individual has might make him or her do something they wouldn't normally do. It's not an exact science. It's not something that will guarantee that something may or may not happen. It's one element that could be taken in consideration for a whole profile. Once again, depending on the type of industry you're in, depending on the type of job this person is applying for, a credit check might not be something that you could use as a tool in the adjudication process, either because there's no need for it in the type of job that they'll be doing, or you might be doing because it might be a regulatory requirement. But then again, you would have to look with your compliance and legal department to see if a credit check would be something that would be good for your business. So when it comes back to credit pressure, what we're looking at is if you look at the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, there's such a thing as what they call the fraud triangle. So you would have 3 pillars, basically. You would have opportunity, rationalization, and pressure. So the opportunity would be the employment they would have with you. The rationalization would be the logic that you would be giving themselves to be conducting something that they shouldn't be doing, and the pressure would be the financial pressure. So what we're looking at is the financial pressure. So what we're looking at is normally a situation that, let's say I have a colleague, very basic situation where you would have, $100 fall out of his pocket. I would say normally, hey, Dan, you dropped $100 out of your pocket. But if I'm in a situation where I have a very high degree of pressure financially, I might look at that same situation and say, if I don't tell Dan that you dropped $100, I might just take it, he won't notice it, and it'll help me pay my hydro bill this month. Doesn't make you a bad person, but it might change the way you might act in front of a certain situation. So that's why some individuals or some companies would provide credit checks or do credit checks. Another tool that you might want to use as well is a data aggregation service. So the most common are Canly and WorldCheck. So what these companies will provide you are information that you won't necessarily find on Google. So it's what one layer down, normally behind paywalls, these services will provide you with databases, public and private, that will aggregate data on certain individuals. So usually what you'll get is sanctions checks, terrorist watch lists. Basically, they'll do aggregation of news articles from around the world pertaining to certain individuals. Depending on how detailed a certain person's profile is, they might even provide you with family relations to other individuals. Now, it's a very interesting data set they have, but a lot of times when you do have matches, you don't necessarily have date of births. So that is something that you would have to do a lot more due diligence on if you do get a match. Now, once again, depending on regulatory requirements, you might have to do it, you might not have to, but it is a good source of information. Now, when it comes to consent forms, depending on if you're outsourcing most of your activities, usually your provider will provide you with a consent form. That's already been vetted, verified, and make sure that everything is, all the requirements are there. Yet you have the RCMP disclosure statements that there's information pertaining to privacy and what the individual's rights are when it comes to having the background check conducted. Obviously a person that has a background check done on them has a right to have access to the data that was collected. There has to be a mechanism on the consent form to provide them with a way to get that information if they wanted to, or even dispute any information that was collected, and they have a right to have that information corrected if it is wrong. Now, you could have it your own consent form, but that comes with all the due diligence that I just mentioned. You have to make sure that all the information is correct and that it is a legal document. So most of the time, what happens is people will just provide the candidates with a consent form that the provider uses. But that's something you could definitely look over with legal and your provider. So there's a lot more. We won't put too much focus on that. I want to leave some time for some questions. But when it comes to consent form, you really want to make sure that it's compliant with all federal and even provincial laws. So it is very, very technical. So it's not just a question of I consent to having a background check done. There's a lot more to it than that. So I'll open up. Usually we get a lot of questions when it comes to these kinds of things. So I'll open up for questions. I'll leave a good 15 minutes for questions. So Pam, if there's any questions, just let me know. I'll try my best to answer them.
No, thank you so much, Matthew. I'm not sure if anybody could see the chat. If there are any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. I don't see any. Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It doesn't seem to be that there are any questions from any of our participants. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a good afternoon.
There is a question that came in, actually.
Oh, yeah, one just came in.
Yeah.
So do you recommend a criminal check for part-time student jobs?
So that's a very good question. So if the student is a minor, obviously there's no way of checking their criminal history because it's sealed. However, there is certain things that you may be able to check. You could do the Google search. Obviously, on minors, it's very, very limited. A lot of companies will still conduct a background check. Giving an example, in Quebec, as of the age of 16, a person that is 16 and over could consent to a background check as if they were an adult for the purposes of their employment. Now, it still doesn't give you consent to look at the CPIC database. All of that is sealed. All court records are sealed. However, you could still do the Google search. You could still do the Canly search, the data aggregation services, and you could still even look at the credit file. The credit file could give you more information as well. A lot of times they will still have a credit file even if they're under 18. Most of the time it's when they go and get their cell phone that will create their credit file, but you can look at any aliases. Now, there is no best practices when it comes to conducting background checks on minors because the information is so limited. So then again, it comes down to what you want to do when it comes to your company's best practices. A lot of them still do it, but you have to expect that you're not going to be getting a lot of information from it. A lot of times people that do conduct background checks on students and minors will do it for compliance reasons more than anything else. Now, we're talking about students. Students could be adults as well, depending on what level of education they're at. Obviously, if they're adults, conduct a background check. No doubt about it. Even if it's for temporary employment, depending on what industry you're in, you don't want to take a chance. So even if you're hiring a student for on-the-job training, if it's for, forget the word in English, but in French it's a stage. So basically if they're doing their end of semester on-the-job training, do a background check. Don't take any chances on that. Sorry, there was a question that just came in. I didn't see it here. Hold on a sec. Is a consent form needed for a simple Google search? I'm not a lawyer, but nothing stops you from doing a Google search on someone. I think the consent is more on how you're going to use the information in the end. I mean, if you're going to start Googling people as a requirement for employment, most likely you'll have a consent form. So I would always suggest if you're doing a search on someone as a pre-employment check, get a consent, because you never know what you might end up finding. Depending on what you find, you might want to use. If you want to use it, you need a consent. But obviously, Googling someone, you don't need a consent. It's how you use the data after that really might restrict you. There is a question on top here when it comes to, can we do the same kind of a criminal check for volunteers? Yes. A lot of companies and a lot of organizations who rely heavily on volunteers will conduct criminal background checks as well. Now, if you're looking at certain organizations that do use a lot of volunteers, a lot of these companies actually need vulnerable sector checks. So yes, even if you're a volunteer and not actually being paid to conduct a role with an organization, a criminal background check, most of the time would be not, I wouldn't say useful, I would say mandatory.
If anybody has any further questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask them.
Oh, there's another one here. Typical cost of doing a thorough search. It really depends, because it depends on how many services you're using to provide that search, right? Obviously, if you're just doing a CPIC search, it's the CPIC costs. And it also depends on the volume too, right? Obviously, if you have a low volume, your cost is going to go up. If you have a high volume, you pay less. Now, if you're using services like WorldCheck, that's a few $1,000s a year. If you're using court runners, a typical court runner search could cost you anywhere between $40 and $60. If you're using Sakij, like I mentioned before, just looking at an index, basically just doing one search is $3, almost $4, and looking at an actual court record is about $4.50. So the cost of doing a thorough search, if you really want to go thorough, and how many databases you're looking at, could go anywhere from let's say about $20 to even $100 or more. If you're going international, a typical international background check is about, I would say, about $120 US per check. So there's no real answer for that. It really depends on how wide your scope is and where you're looking for. Medical and drug tests, are they legal? I'm not going to go super deep into detail with that because it's not something that I have a huge experience with. However, I do have colleagues that do deal with that. As far as I know, and that you'll have to look with legal, there has to be a very, very specific case for you to do medical and drug tests, and usually it has to do with where you're operating machinery which might put someone else's life in danger, so basically bus drivers or heavy equipment operators. Usually could be subject to those kinds of tests, but you would have to verify with your legal department, basically make sure that you could conduct them for the type of job that you're looking to fill. But it wouldn't be something that you would do at large with all of your all employees. Definitely not.
Matthew, are there different types of checks done at different levels of employment? We're talking about a high level and low level jobs.
Well, see, that's where company policy comes into place, right? And it also depends on regulatory requirements. For financial institutions in Canada, there is a requirement to have a higher standard for certain types of positions, and certain positions need to be checked on a regular basis. So there could be a different tier system within the company for background checks. Definitely. I mean, there could be a tier system where if you're looking at people that are on the board of directors or people that have certain access to financial systems, you might want to include also a civil court record search to see if there's any civil litigation against these individuals in the past. That might be a good indication. But yes, there could be a tiered system. My employer has a tiered system as well. I mean, it's very dependent on the sector of activity that you work in, regulatory requirements, and as well as company policy as well. I mean, obviously, if you have a very large scope of checks, it takes more time. You might want to have a lower tier for entry-level positions, and as you go up, you have a more wide spectrum of checks that are done for those types of employments. It really has to do with turnaround time, company tolerance, and regulatory requirements. But yes, you could definitely have a tiered system. So there is a question here in French. So if we basically have people coming international to our business, now we should ask for their police certificate from the company that they're coming from. So yes, so basically, most of these individuals will have that document because it is part of the immigration process. Depending on your service provider, there are many of them. I don't want to single one out, but there's Sterling, there's Mint, there's companies like Certain and things like that. There is dozens of service providers, and most all of these providers will be able to take that document and get it recertified. So there is obviously a difference between recertifying a document and getting your own document. Recertifying is a lot faster, but most of them should be able to do it. So basically what they do is they take your document and say, hey, country of origin, this document was presented to us. Can you verify that it hasn't been modified and that is authentic since the time of issue? And they'll come back with a yes or a no. You could do that, or you could conduct your own background check. But like I mentioned, there's a lot of delays and the cost is a lot higher. But it wouldn't be, I wouldn't suggest doing it yourself. If you already have a provider that does background checks for you, especially internationally or even locally, chances are they have a service that will be able to provide that certification process for you.
Thank you, Matthew. I'll ask one last quick question. What about seasonal employers, such as Santa Claus in the shopping centers at Christmas time?
So, yeah, that's I was already asked that question in the past. Especially if we're dealing with Santa Claus, most of the time it's a vulnerable sector check. So, there's cases where I was asked, we have these little elves and Santa Claus. Should we do background checks? The simple answer is yes, you should. Because especially if your company is hiring these individuals on the company's behalf, you want to make sure that the people that are dealing with the children, have a clean background. It really does become a reputational risk at that point. So yes, I would still do seasonal employers. I would take them like a temporary student. Basically, you would still do background checks on them if you're onboarding these individuals. But yes, definitely, I would do it.
If anybody has any more questions, we're happy to answer them. Matthew, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for participating. We will send out a version of this presentation shortly. And if there are any further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a good afternoon.